So yeah, what I wanted to show you all really quickly is I wanted to show you all the discussion board. It is available now. Um, so just to reiterate, I know some of you all had asked some questions about this, that the way the discussions work is that there's not a chapter discussion per chapter. Originally, I did things like that in semesters past, but I felt that that was a little bit too much work for my students, and so I decided to cut down the discussions to where now we're just going to do one discussion per unit. Um, so I do have the unit discussion ready for you all, and so I wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of go over with you all, give you all some hints, give you all some suggestions in terms of how to go about completing the discussion here. So let me go ahead and share the screen, and then that way you all can see here. Okay, hold on, let me get this going. Which, by the way, before we start on that, connection is poor. Others will see. Okay, all right, hold on. Let me fix that really quickly. It could be an issue with the internet. But before while I'm fixing that, are y'all doing okay? Does anybody have any questions or concerns, or is there anything I can help y'all with before I go over the discussion with you all? Is there anything that I can help you all with? Anything that you all have questions about? So I hope that my discussion right now cleared up some questions that you all might have. But in the meantime, I just want to see if you all have any other further questions, or is there anything else that you needed to discuss with me? Um, Nothing else? Okay, test one will cover, yes, Anna, yes, that's correct. It's going to cover chapters 1 through 4. So we will cover chapter 4 today, the key points of chapter 4, and then from that you should be ready. Like I said, the study guide should also be very helpful for you all. I'm definitely trying to craft it to where it should be helpful on the test, and you'll see what I'm talking about once you see through the study guide, and once you work on the test, you'll see that it should be very helpful. So, but that's why I wanted to. Yeah, it's going to be good. Yes, Ebony. Yes, I'm almost done with it. I'm going to try to see if I can finish it by today, because I'm still there's still a little bit from the test. There's still like some questions that I'm still kind of sifting through. So that's why there's been a little bit of delay, and of course with what happened on Monday. So, but yes, I'll get you all the study guide for sure by this week for sure. That way you all can have a whole week to study it and be prepared for the test. So what that also means is that later on in the semester, because I know we do have the 4 tests we have to do. I'm thinking that maybe like for the 4 test we might do like, I don't know, like maybe like a take-home essay or something like that. We'll see. We'll figure out what we need to do. But like I don't want to have a situation where you all are like taking like 2 sit-down tests back to back. You know what I mean? So maybe we'll do something like that where I'll give like the final like in a different format or something like that, where it's not really a test. It's more so like maybe like an extended assignment, something like that. But we can make adjustments like that because like we said, we can be flexible with how things are with the semester here. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and we'll have the first test coming up. But yes, it'll be, is the exam lockdown browser? Okay. Yeah, it will be in that the test online is going to simulate if you were doing the test in person, right? So it's still going to be proctored the same way, the same amount of time. So it's supposed to not be any different than like if you were taking the test in person. So yes, it will be proctored. But again, it's not really going to matter really because since you can use your notes in your book, you don't have to worry about like, is anyone going to go and like, tell you something while you're taking the test on the lockdown browser. As I mentioned before, the thing that I'm going to be looking at, because I'm the one who looks at that video, is just to make sure that you're not taking the test with someone else, that someone's not helping you. So even if you're like having to look down, like, because I know some professors are really strict, right? They're like, oh, you can't look this way, you can't look that way. But because it's open note, you can look around. That's not a problem. Like I said, what I'm going to be looking for in the video is just to make sure that you all aren't like, there's not like 5 people in a room like all working on the test together. You know what I mean? So that you can't do because you definitely do have to do the test on your own. But as long as you're doing the test on your own, and as long as you are not doing that, when it comes to like collaborating with people, then you should be fine. So don't worry about it. It's not going to flag you or anything like, oh, like you're using notes or whatever, because I'm allowing you all to use your notes. So it shouldn't flag you or anything like that. Okay, other questions. Okay, no other questions? All right, okay, sounds good. Okay, so then is the exam going to be at a certain time? Okay, so we had talked about, yes, we're still going to have the in-person option. We had talked about how having the test on Monday, right? I think you all had said that you all wanted to have it on Monday. Um, so if that's the case, then it would not be Monday the 17th, but it'd be on the 24th. So yeah, so the plan is to have it on the 24th of October. So that would be when we would have it. And then we'll see, like, for the other tests and things like that. Because I know with time we're we've got a little bit of an issue with time, but don't worry, that's fine. We'll still do everything that we need to. We just might have to crunch everything a little bit more towards the end, but that's fine. That's why I said, I'm not going to make you take like two like in-person tests back to back. We'll do something where like maybe the last test or whatever can be like, take home essays or something like that. So we'll see. We can do something like that to where it doesn't feel like a test so far, but anyway, but we'll see how that goes later on. But for now, yes, we will have the in-person option. Yes, that's true. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's see. Other questions. Other questions y'all have. Other questions y'all have. Very good questions, by the way. Very good questions. Okay. No other questions. Okay. All right. So let me go ahead and show you all really quickly. Let me show you all the discussion here really quickly. So like I said, I'm going to go over it with you all really quickly. Hopefully the internet connection is a little bit better now. Good. It's a little bit better. Okay. So let me show you all the discussion. Okay. So this is the Unit 1 discussion. Now, as I mentioned before, each unit's going to have its own discussion. So the discussion question is, how did the English Empire in America expand in the mid-17th century? So this question is looking at, all the colonies that, of course, were, that all the colonies, I'm sorry, that something ran past my window. All the colonies, of course, that, were chartered by the British, if we start all the way, going back to Jamestown and the Chesapeake region, then, going over to Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. And then, we're going to talk, and then we've talked a little bit about, the Carolinas. We talked about the Carolinas last week. We're going to talk about Georgia here this week. So all of those different, colonies that, those British colonies that began in America. The question is asking, not just to discuss those colonies, but also how did the British Empire go about expanding, these territories, right? Like, what were the reasons for why the British were so interested in starting colonies along the eastern seaboard, right? So some suggestions to talk about could be like, maybe talk about some of the cash crops that these areas were specializing in, such as tobacco in Virginia, rice over there in the Carolinas. Also, talk about the lumber industry, going up in there in the New England colonies, right? So, and then of course, you can also talk about the plantations going on in the American South. We talked a little about that last week. We'll talk a little bit more about it as well this week. And the growing, slave trade that was going on. So there's a lot that you can do with this question, again, because since it's a very brief question, there's a lot of different avenues that you can go with this, right? And so I wanted to give you all a couple of suggestions, ideas in terms of not only what the question is asking, but how to go about answering these questions, right? So this question is a good question because it takes several concepts that we've learned in the last couple of chapters. And what I'm looking for, because the whole point of these discussions is for y'all to demonstrate, are you able to demonstrate that you all have read through the material and that you understand it? Let me see if there's a question here. Let's see. When can we find the discussion board? Okay, so let me show you where it's located. All right, so there's different ways to get to it. So if you click on, let's see, if you click on discussions, it will take you to it. And there's going to be stuff that you're not going to be able to see because that's my view. But yeah, if you click on there, it takes you to the discussion. There's also another way to get to it. If you go to your module here, there should be a link that takes you to the discussion where it's embedded in there, and it's the same page. So if you go over here, you see how like there's a discussion board. There's a tab right here. So if you click on it, it's going to take you to the exact page that we were just on, right? So then you scroll down and then you get to the Unit 1 discussion. So that's the ways to be able to find it. So it's either on the left over here, or it's embedded within the chapter module. So that's where you're able to find it here. So yeah, if you all need help trying to find it, just let me know, and I'll definitely help you all out with that. Okay, but let's go back to the discussion as well. Now, so that of course is the question, right? And I've given you all some ideas in terms of how to answer this question. Now, there's also some discussion expectations as well as some requirements here. So these first couple of ones are, general expectations, suggestions, things that I want you all to think about as you all are answering these discussion questions. And of course, like I said, I'll give you all some of my own insight and my own observations that I've seen over the years in terms of grading discussion. So basically what it's asking you all is to, try to answer the question, early on, so that way you can be able to respond to classmates, because you don't want to have a situation where just everyone's posting like Tuesday night and then no one actually gets to respond to anyone, right? So, so it's a good idea would be to, try to post early if you can. Also, the responses themselves also is important. Don't just put like, I agree, or, good ideas or whatever. And let me explain to you all really quickly one observation I've made when I've been grading discussions the last several years, is that normally students do very well with the actual answering of the question, because this is pretty straightforward, right? I mean, I give you all some ideas about how to answer this question. Where students sometimes get into trouble a little bit is where in the responses, they might not necessarily be sure how to respond to these questions. So what I would suggest to you all is, when you all are looking to respond to a classmate, definitely look at what they put in there and add something to it. So if, let's say, someone is talking about, the tobacco industry and how that was paramount in allowing for Virginia to really take off, talk a little bit about, why it took off. Why was it that, tobacco was in such high demand in Europe, right? Talk about, what that also had to do, why is it that the tobacco industry also brought about the need for slavery, right? To in terms of, so one thing you could explain is that because of the headright system, because so many people owned land, that no one was really around to be hired to farm the land, right? To go and harvest the crops, right? Everyone was a landowner for the most part, right? At least the really well-to-do ones. And some people, of course, had more land than others. But the idea was that because land was so plentiful, that there wasn't anyone that was necessarily working for people. There weren't ranch hands to be found, because everyone was a rancher. Does that kind of make sense? That everybody was pretty much a landowner of some kind. So because everyone was wanting to go into business for themselves, it didn't allow for for there to be a lot of people that would be willing to work on someone else's land. So that's what ultimately led to the slave industry basically becoming what it became, because of this issue, that there wasn't anyone to be hired. You know what I mean? So maybe talk about some of those things, right? So in your responses, expand on what your classmates have said, because you're trying to keep the conversation going, so to speak, right? And so and it gives, right, build upon the posts and response of other learners. So that's what it's basically talking about here. Now this, of course, is I probably should bold this, so I'll go back and I'll bold this. Make sure that you all meet these requirements, right? So make sure that, because there are word length requirements, there's also sentence length requirements. So your first initial post where you answer the question up here, this has to be at least 200 words, okay? And it has to be at least 200 words because this is not a simple, like, couple of word answer, right? There's a lot of different reasons and a lot of different examples as to how the British Empire expanded in the mid 17th century. And there's a lot of examples of it, and there's a lot of reasons for why it expanded. So that's not a question that you're going to be able to really answer in one or two sentences in just a few words, right? You're going to have to expand upon this. You're going to have to use examples from the reading. That's another important point, is make sure that the answers that you give, that it's backed up by what you have read in the readings. you know, you don't necessarily have to cite things, although you're more than welcome to if you'd like. Um, you know, for sure, if you're going to cite something, make sure that you do cite it. But again, you can just kind of give, you know, general answers, you know, from what you read in the readings. You can kind of paraphrase it. But if you are, of course, going to cite, then make sure you do cite so accordingly, and you do it correctly, which I'm sure you all know how to cite already by now, right? I mean, you know, with the you know, the quotation marks and then putting the author and the year and all that. So I'm sure you all know how to do that. But the point is that make sure that you use examples from the readings. Just don't give general ideas. Don't give your opinion. I mean, yes, of course, obviously, you're going to give your thoughts on these answers, but make sure that you back it up with examples from the reading, because as I mentioned before, this is the point of these discussions. I want to make sure that you all are understanding the readings, that you all understand the key concepts. And this is a very broad question that, you know, you know, from what we've talked about in the last couple of chapters, you should already know this question, right? This should be very straightforward. And so in the next unit, I know we're going to be getting into like the revolution, and we're going to get into the US Constitution. So there'll probably be a question, you know, related on, you know, one of those two topics here. So again, just, you know, think about this here and make sure that, you know, that your answer is at least 200 words, that you're using examples from the book. Also make sure that it contains at least 5 sentences. Now, but all 3 of these responses, because remember, you have to make 3 total posts per question, right? So you're going to answer the question here. That's 1 post. And then you're going to make 2 other responses to 2 of your classmates, which should be pretty straightforward. I think you all have done discussions before, right, in other classes. So you're used to this, right? It should be pretty straightforward. So with that being said, make sure that the first post that you make is at least 200 words, and then make sure that your 2 other responses are 100 words each, and that they're also at least 5 sentences. So all 3 posts have to be at least 5 sentences. The first one has to be at least 200 words, and the other 2 have to be at least 100 words. So this will be due the same time. This will be due on the let's see, I believe it's the 25th. I believe. Let's see. Yeah, the 25th. So you have about 2 weeks to finish this one here. Like I said, if you need a little bit extra time, that's totally fine. Just please make sure that you complete this as quickly as you can. Don't worry, I'm not going to take off for points or whatever. Just make sure that you try to get it in as quickly as you can here. Okay, so with that being said, does anyone have any questions on the discussions itself? Does it make sense or not really in terms of what I was explaining here? Are you very strict with the grading? Okay, Anne. So that's the $1 million question, right? So okay. All right. So let me ask you this question, Anne, since you bring this up. From what you've seen so far in terms of how our class has been, and I don't mean that we've had health problems or things like that, do you think that I'm strict in general or not so strict? Let's see. What do you think? I want to see what you think about this, because I'm going somewhere with it. No, not strict. Okay. So if I'm not strict, then do you think I'm going to be strict on the grading of the discussions? And I'm going somewhere with this. Okay, so let me explain, because I don't want people to say, oh, Mr. Gonzalez, he's like super easy. Let me explain what I'm trying to say here, while not saying it that way. If you follow through with what I just said, if you follow through with meeting the guidelines, answering the question, meeting the word and the sentence requirements, then I can guarantee you that you will get a good grade. If you don't meet those requirements, then wondering what you would do if we didn't cover everything. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Okay, I see what you mean. Now, I guess you could say I am strict when it comes to like the word requirements. So if it's not 5 sentences, for sure, you will get counted off for that. There's also a rubric that I use as well with it, which let me see if I can find it, because that's, yeah. Let me see if I can show you all the rubric really quickly. Let's see. Because I know that because I do grade on a rubric. I want to see if I can. Let me see if I can find the rubric so I can show it to you all really quickly. Okay, yeah. Here's the discussion rubric. So let me show it to you all really quickly. Okay, let me share the screen so I can show you all the rubric here. And yes, you are right. The question is very vague, but it's vague on purpose, Anae, because. So I get what you're saying. The question is vague. There's a lot you can do with it. So because there's a lot you can do with it, I can't be strict with you because there's a lot of different ways that you can answer this question. So I'm not going to be like, oh no, you didn't talk about every single thing that we talked about in the chapters, right? Because there's a lot of different factors. As long as you hit on like at least one major one, then you're going to be fine. Okay. You don't need to write a whole paper on all those different factors, right? So if you want to strictly talk about the economics, I wanted to get clear to know some teachers are very strict. Yes, I get what you're saying. And you're absolutely right. Because it's a very broad question, there's a lot of different ways you can answer this. And you see, and the thing about that is that, yeah, that wouldn't be fair if let's say you talk about the tobacco industry, and I'm like, well, but you didn't talk about, you didn't talk about the Puritans or this or that. You didn't talk about, the transatlantic slave trade. Now, definitely do, for sure, definitely try to hit on those if you can, but you don't have to like write an entire like research paper about all those, right? Because talking about all of them in great detail would probably take a lot of time, right? Again, this is just 200 words. So again, what I would recommend is try to hit on all those and try to explain them a bit. But as long as you're very concise with what you do explain and it's correct, I can guarantee you that you're not going to get a bad grade. Okay? Yes, because I don't get it either. Because in history, because there's so many things in history, I don't see how a professor could like say, oh, well, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that. I mean, if I wanted for y'all to specifically talk about that, then I would put that in the question. I'd be like, okay, talk about the tobacco industry, talk about the transatlantic slave trade. So if I'm leaving it to y'all to be very open-ended, then the answers can also be open-ended. So no, you're exactly right, and I hope I don't like, I'm not trying to like scare anyone or make anyone feel like that, because it's vague that you might not know what to expect. No, don't worry. If as long as whatever you pick to answer that question, as long as you explain it, that's all I'm looking for. If you want to focus on transatlantic slave trade, then just talk about it, explain what it is, give examples from the reading. You should be okay. All right. So does that kind of make a little bit more sense, or not really? Because again, I'm not going to be strict when it comes to like, oh, you didn't talk about every single thing. So just focus on what you all feel is most important, and then as long as you explain it, I can guarantee you that you will get a decent grade, or you'll get a good grade. But like I said, I guess what you can say I am strict is the word requirements, the length requirements. So make sure that you do meet that, because unfortunately I have to be strict on that, because in semesters past I've had students turn in like one sentence responses, and I'm like, oh no, that's and honestly that was my fault for not putting those requirements. I should have been more specific. So that's why I put those requirements in there, because I saw that some students were turning in like not college level writing. So I had to go and put that in there for that reason. But yeah, no, you should be fine. But let me go ahead and show you all the rubric really quickly. So let's see. Oh, sorry, there was another question here. How do you want citations to work? Okay, Christopher. So if you do, again, citations are not required. If you do use a citation, though, make sure that you have you done citations before, like where you do like the parentheses, not parentheses, the quotation marks, and then do in the parentheses like the author's name and the year, the last name of the year. Have you done those, or not really? It's basically the same thing that you've done, like if you've written like papers or something like that. All I'm saying is that if you are going to cite from the book, make sure that you provide a citation so that you give credit to the author. So as long as you do that, then you should be fine. Does that make sense, or do you need me to explain it a little bit more? Because basically all I'm saying is what you've used in the past. If you've used citation, well, I guess my question is, have you done citations before in another class or no? Yes. Okay. All right. So just keep doing what you've been doing before. Just keep doing that. I'm not strict about, like, because I know some professors, they want APA, MLA. Look, I'm not strict about that. Just make sure that if you do use if you are going to quote, make sure that you do cite your quotations. That's all I'm asking. So however you do it in another class or whatever, that's fine. Just make sure that you do provide the citation, just because we, out of respect to give credit to the author. So, okay, sounds good. All right, sounds good. Very good question. Okay, so then let me show you the rubric really quickly, very quickly, so that way you all can see how this operates. Let's see. Because let me show you all the rubric here really quickly. Okay, all right, so let's see. If I go to edit it, it should show up. Let's see. So are you all able to see the rubric or no? Can you all see it? Where it says rubric detail? Someone tell me, because I can't tell that that you all can. All right, let me go back here really quickly. So, hold on, sorry. Oh, you all can see it. Okay, all right, then let me go back here. Okay, so oh shoot, sorry about that. Okay, oh no, wrong. Okay, here it is. Okay, it's because I'm sorry, because my mom uses the computer too, and she works for the Beth O'Rourke campaign. So if you see some stuff like for Beth O'Rourke, it's because she's a manager on the campaign here. Okay, so anyway, so with that being said, here's the rubrics, right? So again, so because there's 3 total posts, you know, the first post is 34% and the other 2 is 33 and 33, right? So it adds up to 100. So again, there's going to be proficiency, competency, and novice, right? So if you're writing at a proficiency level, the way it works is that the post significantly exceeded minimum requirements for length and thoughtfulness of content, right? So this is the best you can do, right? So if you're meeting the word length requirements, you're incorporating ideas from the readings, then you're going to get proficiency. You're going to get competency if, yes, you meet the word and sentence requirements and it is related to the topic, but maybe you're just not really explaining too much. You're just kind of just giving, you know, real basic answers. You're not really expanding upon it. Then that's going to be competency. Novice, if you don't include like the 5 sentences. So if you give like a really short response, you'll only get half credit. Now, also do keep in mind that if you don't, because I've also had situations where students, and they don't do it on purpose, it's just that they get confused. Sometimes I've had students just answer the question and they don't do the 2 responses. So if you don't do the 2 responses, you're not going to get any credit. So unfortunately, like you're going to get, like you'll just get the third. Like if let's say you do proficiency because the 1 post you do is very good, so you get 34, but then you're not going to get anything for the other 2 because there's nothing to grade, right? There's no post there. So make sure that you do at least 3 total posts per discussion, so that way, you know, you can try to get a really good grade on here. So does this make sense as well to you all? Does this make sense? Or because again, this is the rubric that I use to grade the discussions here. So again, everything's very straightforward. There's no surprises here. I'm giving you all the rubric. I'm giving you all examples. I'm explaining to you all what I'm looking for. So I don't think there should be any problems then, right? I mean, is it pretty clear in terms of what I'm asking for and what I'm looking for in these posts, or not really? Is there anything that still doesn't make sense? Or okay, Paul says yes. Okay, good. So I just want to make sure that you all are definitely understanding this, because, and look, and I understand. Look, if let's say you have a situation where, if let's say, you know, you miss the requirements, you know, I can go back and I can let you all redo it. Okay, so you know, so you know, because sometimes that happens, right? Where sometimes students will forget, like maybe they'll make 2 posts instead of the 3, or maybe they just make the 1. You know, if I grade it, you know, I'll put feedback where, like, you know, go back and redo it. So don't worry. Again, as I've said before, as long as you get it done, you'll be fine. Okay. Like I said, history is not a class that you all should be stressing about. There's plenty of other classes that definitely require you all stress, but not history. That's for sure. Okay. All right. So with that being said, anything else that any questions that you all have about the discussions, the test, the availability of everything? Is there anything else that you all have questions about? Anything else before we discuss chapter 4 here in a bit? Anything else? Nothing else? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get chapter 4 ready here. So, okay. So let me go back out of here, and then let's go to chapter 4 here. Now, let me also mention to you all that, like I said, I'm going to add some more of these things. I still have some more of the resources that I still need to add. So that's still something that's still also being added. So just be on the lookout for that. But let's go ahead and go to chapter 4 here really quickly. Now, let me ask you all this question really quickly. Have y'all had a chance to kind of go through chapter 4, kind of get a sense for what it's about, or not really? Anybody had a chance to read through it a bit, or? And again, I always ask this, and the answer is usually no, but it's fine. Don't worry about it. I mean, I'm not, again, you know, we all got our things we're working on, but I just wanted to ask if anyone has had, okay, I mean, not yet. Okay. Yeah. And the reason why I ask is not to put anyone on the spot. I'm just I just want to know if you all have had a chance to kind of look through it a bit. So that way maybe we can have a quick discussion about what you all thought of the chapter so far. But that's okay. We'll go ahead and just, kind of dive in here. Basically, what chapter 4 is about. Chapter 4 is going to focus a lot on the expansion of the slave trade, not just within America, but through the transatlantic slave trade that was going on, in which the three, well, you can say the four major continents were being linked, right? Africa, Europe, North and South America were all being linked here through this transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was basically a collection of trade routes where all these different goods and items were being shipped off all across, these, all across on all the sides of the Atlantic here. So, definitely a big departure from just a couple of 100 years before, where no one even knew that the Western Hemisphere existed. Now everyone is because there was money to be made in these major. That's something that maybe historians don't really talk about, or it doesn't really get talked about too much. But just imagine the money that was made from all of this trading that was going on. This made people very, very rich in terms of, all the goods and commodities that were being sold. And unfortunately, we also saw some very unfortunate effects of this, right? The separating of families when it came to what was going on in the African continent, and just a very, very sad situation with, families being torn apart, families losing their identities too. Like, back in the 1970s, they had that series called Roots. I don't know if you all have heard of it. There's that famous scene where Toby's getting, Kunta Kinte is getting whipped, and they're trying to change his name to Toby, right? Because they're trying to take away his identity, right? They're trying to take away who he is, right? They're trying to take away his native language. They're trying to take away everything because that's what slavery did, to people, right? It wasn't just, putting them in servitude, right? It wasn't just taking them away from their homeland and having them go and work, in another part of the world. It was also breaking them down, right? It was stripping them of who they were, stripping them of their culture, stripping them of their religion, stripping them of their identity and the uniqueness that made them who they are in terms of human beings. And it was meant as a way to dehumanize the slaves, to where it was easier for people to look at them as, subservient, right? Because they didn't have a culture anymore, right? They were being assimilated into the British culture, right? So very, very sad situation in terms of what we've seen. That's why history can be a little bit somber in terms of teaching it and certainly learning it. But that's what we're going to talk about today is the transatlantic slave trade, as well as as well as also some political. We're also going to talk about some political some political ideas here. The ideas of the free rights of Englishmen, and we start to see. We talked a little bit about this before, about how that in Great Britain we were seeing with the English Revolution and then the Glorious Revolution as well, this idea of people having those absolute rights, that the government cannot take away those rights away from you. So we're going to talk about the beginnings of this freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We're going to talk about some of that here as well in this chapter. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War, and we'll talk about the ramifications of that. So let's see if we can go through this really, really quickly here, because I know we have a lot that we need to cover here, but we'll try to do everything that we can here. So, okay, anyway, so let's take a look at this. Okay, so again, so we were talking about the Oladu Ekwano. He's an interesting example of one of the few slaves that was able to break free from servitude and be able to live a rather decent life, and he wrote about his his travels and what he went through. And the book talks about how that unfortunately very few former slaves ultimately reached the level of, I don't want to say comfort, but were able to, I guess, the level of independence and the level of, I guess you could say, somewhat prosperity that he was able to meet. In that, he was a very, very rare case in terms of, because for almost all these slaves, either they passed away, either they died while they were being transported across the Atlantic, or they would die on their plantations, never to see their family again. So very, very, very sad situation. But anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the Atlantic slave trade, right? So again, and of course, another thing we're also going to talk about is how slavery also was able to grow in these areas, right? So So again, so the Atlantic slave trade, a series of triangular trade routes crisscross the Atlantic. Colonial merchants profited from the slave trade, even in areas where slavery was a minor institution, because as we said before, the slavery itself is something that, of course, is important to talk about, and it is important to talk about, the loss of human capital that we saw and the loss of humanity that we were seeing within slavery. But again, like I was mentioning also, that what doesn't really get talked about is just the amount of wealth that that some of that Great Britain was able to generate. I mean, they were able to replace the Dutch as the major trading empire in the world, and so they were able to make a ton of profit, not from the selling of all of these different goods, right? Like the tobacco, the sugar, the rice, all, and then of course, the construction of these goods, because that's the way the Atlantic trade route was. You had, raw materials being sent, you had all kinds of raw materials, right? The book has a good chart of that, right? It shows what items were going where. So take a look at that if you have a chance, and you'll see just how massive this trade enterprise was, and that's why, and we still see, trade being a huge enterprise to this day, right? I mean, raw materials being made in other parts of the world, that's why, we are such an integrated global economy now. And this was kind of the start of that, the start of integrating all of these areas around the world and allowing them to be integrated into this economy here. And slavery became connected with the color black and liberty with the color white. So now we start to see that separation, right? Where because originally, obviously, of course, we had the indentured servants, and they pretty much were looked at as slaves. But now, since that is starting to go away, now that's being replaced by African slave labor, and so now we're starting to see that dichotomy there, right? Where now slavery is being associated with with the African natives being brought over, and the whites are not being considered that anymore. So again, so we see how that, except for the King of Benin, most African rulers took part in the slave trade, gaining guns and textiles in exchange for the slaves. Because yeah, that's another important thing about the slave trade, right? Is that the African rulers also engaged in the slave trade and the selling of their usually of like captured tribes that they had won a war with, and so they would round them up and then sell them in the slave trade, right? So the slave trade was concentrated in Western Africa, in some of these countries, like modern day Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, and some of these, these countries, they're along the, Western Africa here, and it greatly disrupted the region's society and economy because of the fact that you had so many of their own being sent overseas. It really caused huge problems when it came to, to the social, the social order within African society here, because you had, tons and tons of these, these young men that were being shipped off, and so that created issues when it came to birth rates and the family and all that stuff. So okay, so the Middle Passage, of course, this was the name of the trade route that the African slaves would take to cross from Africa to the Atlantic. Slaves were crammed aboard ships for maximum profit. This is really, really sad. If you've ever seen this, where they are just packed in there. Like it is insane to see, like, how human beings being treated like this, right? Not even animals today are packed that closely when it comes to, like, when you see like cattle being shipped. It was horrific. The book talks about how that that disease was rampant. A lot of them didn't make it, and then they would just throw them overboard to not allow for everyone else to get some of these diseases. It was a very, very sad situation. And so the slave traders took most slaves to Brazil and to the West Indies, where death rates were high. So yeah, that's also another important point, right? That the slaves first, their first destination was not America; it was to the sugar plantations in Brazil, as well as over here, like in Barbados and the West Indies and all that. So less than 5% of African slaves went to what became the United States, but the slave population would increase steadily through natural reproduction. So as the slave population started to, they started to have families of their own. That's what led to the growing here, right? So, okay, so Chesapeake slavery. So 3 distinct slave systems were entrenched in Britain's mainland colonies. We had the Chesapeake, South Carolina, Georgia, and the non-plantation societies of New England and the Middle Colonies. So definitely do take a look at the differences here, how in terms of, the plantation sizes, the crops that the different areas were focusing on, and how the slaves were being treated in some of these places, right? So like in the Northeast, slavery was not necessarily, it wasn't what you think of when you think of slavery, like working on those large plantations. Instead, slaves in the Northeast tended to be like your house servants, maybe your cooks and things like that, basically working in the house. Whereas in the southern states, they tended to work outside, so to speak, right? So the Chesapeake slavery, of course, was based on tobacco, and after 1680, labor switched from indentured servitude to slavery. And as Virginians moved westward, so did slavery here. So, of course, we talked about Bacon's Rebellion last time, and how that also had some impact in terms of moving further west. The Virginians wanting to move further west, and so the center of slavery moved from the Tidewater region, which is there along the coast, over to the Piedmont, which is more inland here. And then slavery transformed Chesapeake society into an elaborate hierarchy of degrees of freemen. So at the very top, of course, you had the large plantation owners. You also had the yeoman farmers. These, of course, were more like, not having as large farms, but they still owned them. The indentured servants and tenant farmers, these, of course, were people that there still were some indentured servants, but there were nowhere near as many as what we had seen before. And then, of course, you had the tenant farmers who, they didn't own the farm, right? They worked on the farm, but the farm belonged to someone else. And then, of course, you have the slaves at the very bottom. So again, you start to see this racial division, right, where white people are starting to not be seen as slaves. They're starting to move up, within the socioeconomic ladder, whereas the slaves are still maintaining, the bottom rungs here, so to speak. But okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. So again, so this goes a little bit more into detail in terms of how slaves were being treated. So we see here in the Virginia area, with the consolidation of a slave society, planters enacted laws to protect their power over the slaves. Excuse me. Race became more important as a line of social division. Free blacks lost rights as free, and white became virtually identical. So this is where you started to see those differences, where we kind of talked about a little about this last time, right? The idea that, if you had like if you had like a biracial family, that that the offspring would still be considered black, right? So we started to see some of that, where if you had any African American heritage, then you would be considered black, right? So we started to see that like I said, that lowering of the socioeconomic status in terms of the African Americans that are here. And then in early Carolina, we saw that the Creek Indians initially sold the early settlers their slaves, generally war captives, and the captives' families. So for a brief time, we did have Native American slaves, but again, that was short-lived, because again, we started to see the importation of the slaves from Africa here. Rice, so the rice kingdom, this is very important, right? So down in the southern colonies, such as in South Carolina and Georgia, they relied heavily on rice. And the book talks about that, that what was sad about the rice, as well as indigo, right? Indigo, of course, was used, for the coloring of dye and all that stuff. The sad thing that happened with, on these plantations here, was that because of the swampiness of the rice, that a lot of these slaves ended up catching malaria and all these different diseases from mosquitoes, because of the fact that you need a lot of water in order to actually harvest rice. So imagine being stuck in shallow standing water day after day. That's just a breeding ground for mosquitoes. So that was very, again, there was no pesticides back then, right? So very, very, very sad to see, in terms of how having to work the rice fields was definitely very, 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 very difficult. And so under the task system, individual slaves did daily jobs, the completion of which allowed time for leisure or cultivation of their own crops, which we did see, some of these, slaves, decide to, harvest their own, so that they could, try to make some extra, money, for the, as well, so they could be able to, purchase necessary items such as food and things like that. So by 1770, the number of South Carolina slaves had reached 75,000, well over half the colony's population. So again, so we start to see that originally America the slavery numbers were not all that high, but like we said, as these plantations grow larger, as these industries grow larger, we start to see the slave population really increase here. Okay, let's talk about Georgia really quickly. So Georgia, of course, was established by a group of philanthropists led by James Oglethorpe in 1733. So James Oglethorpe, he wanted to create a, kind of a, he wanted to create a colony that was that it catered to the poor people, right? So he wanted to, people that were kind of being forced out of the more richer colonies, like in Virginia as well as the Northeast. He wanted for them to come to Georgia. Since Georgia was a a relatively untapped area, and again, this was also a strategic move to kind of keep the Spanish at bay, since the Spanish are still in Florida. So to create another buffer colony between Virginia and Florida here. So he wanted, to bring people that, weren't really all that successful, right? So Oglethorpe had banned liquor and slaves, but the settlers demanded their right of self-government and repealed the bans by early 1750. And then in 1751, Georgia became a royal colony. So even though, and we see this, right? We saw this like in Maryland, we saw this in Pennsylvania, that originally, the benefactors of these colonies they had a vision for how they wanted for the colonies to operate. But eventually, as more colonists, showed up, then it was out of their hands, because now there was more of a majority and people wanted different things. But okay, anyway, so slavery in the North, just like we talked about, again, slavery was not as prevalent as what we saw in the South because of the small farms. It was mostly slavery was a lot smaller. It was mostly, like I said, people working in the home, so to speak. Given that slaves were few and posed little threat to the white majority, laws were less harsh than in the South. And slaves did represent a sizable percentage of urban laborers, particularly in New York and Philadelphia. So in the larger cities, you did have slaves. Not that they were working on the farms, but they were, you could have a situation where you would have like shopkeepers, blacksmiths. They might have slaves that would help them with their, help them with, with running the business, so to speak, right? In terms of like an apprenticeship, right? So that's where you would see, slaves up north that would help with the business, right, as opposed to just working on the farm here. Okay, all right, so let's see, because we have about 15 minutes left, so I definitely want to try to go through everything that we kind of need to. So again, this part here, again, just note that this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, right? That because the slaves were basically losing their cultural identity, they started to to band together themselves, right? Because a lot of these Africans were of different parts of the continent, right? So they were of different countries, different tribes. But now they started to become more closer together through this kinship because of slavery itself, right? Because now they're all in this together, being brought from Africa and now working in this foreign country, right? So for most of the 18th century, most American slaves were African by birth. And then, of course, we start to see that unfortunately their native religions were being replaced by Christianity. Although in some cases you also had the melding of these religions, right? And we still see that to this day. Like I know Santeria is an example that we see like in the Caribbean, where they meld, Christianity with some of these, some of these mystical, other, religious aspects, from other religions. So they kind of mix it all together here. So we were seeing this here within the African American groups as well here. So again, and the book talks about some of these different ways that these groups operated here. So like in South Carolina, so in the Chesapeake area, the slaves learned English, participated in the Great Awakening, and were exposed to white culture. In South Carolina and Georgia, though, there were two different types of societies, right? So the communities on the rice plantations, they didn't really have too much interaction with the white Americans, right? So they kind of basically still kept their ethnic enclave, so to speak, right? They kept their cultural elements here, such as housing styles, child naming practices, and language here. And they didn't have they really didn't have contact with whites, and they enjoyed much more autonomy when compared to slaves from other economies, because of the fact that the rice was just, again, as I mentioned, imagine being in a swamp and it gets really hot in that part of the country, right? I mean, in the summer it's hot over there just like it's hot here, right? So imagine being having to be waiting in a swamp, and could you imagine how humid it would be, like having to do all that work and harvesting the rice in the swampy areas. So it was so bad that even the plantation owners didn't want to get near the rice field. So instead, they just basically delegated the responsibilities to the slaves, and then the slaves would do it, and then of course the plantation owners would make a profit, right, since it was their slaves. But the idea was that the rice harvesting was so like it was so horrible that even the owners themselves didn't want to get near there. But and again, of course, there was also the beginnings of the resistance to slavery. So we have the The first English 18th century slave uprising occurred in New York City in 1712. We also had uprisings in French Louisiana, as well as some of these Caribbean islands, like in Jamaica. And we also had the Stono Rebellion of 1739. This, of course, was one of the first major rebellions that actually saw some casualties here. And so and we'll talk about some more of these rebellions, like Nat Turner's rebellion. We'll also talk about John Brown, like before the start of the Civil War here. These rebellions were what they did was that they heightened the need to further subjugate the African slaves, right? To not allow for them to have access to firearms, right? They couldn't bear arms, and also leading to an increase in plantation owners carrying arms themselves, right? To be able to ensure that the slaves would not revolt. Because you also have to remember that with these large plantations, there's like tons and tons and tons of these slaves, and there's maybe just a few, there's just like the family of the plantation owners, right? So there's more of them. There was many more slaves than of the slave owners. So the slave owners knew that they had to do something to try to keep the slaves from revolting here. So okay, so last couple of things that we'll talk about here today. So let's talk about the empire freedom. So this is getting into the politics here, right? So despite the centrality of slavery to its empire, 18th century Great Britain prided itself on being the world's most advanced and freest nation. Most Britons shared a common law, a common language, and a common devotion to Protestantism, and a common enemy in France, right? So similar to what we talked about before, these cultural differences between the English and the French, as well as the Spanish as well. Britons believed that wealth, religion, and freedom went together. So this is the kind of like the gospel of prosperity, so to speak, right? That if you own land, if you're very wealthy, that God has blessed you. And if you don't own land and you're poor, then it's your fault, for being lazy and not working hard to be able to get that, right? So that's kind of the Protestant work ethic, I guess you can kind of say, is what we start to see here, not just within not just over there in with the Puritans, but also we're seeing that more across the British Empire, right? So the British Constitution, central to this sense of British identity, was the concept of liberty. Now, we've talked before about how liberty is the idea of freedom, right? This idea of freedom from government control. This idea that, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the American Revolution and how, there's a reason why Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." I mean, if he was willing to die for liberty, that goes to show you that liberty must be something really important, right? So the early concept of liberty, right, was this idea that, like I was saying, right, that people should be able to have this collection of specific rights, a national characteristic, and a state of mind. This idea that the king is not above the law, that the law is supposed to apply to everyone, right? That's why we had the issue with, what was going on with the Glorious Revolution, right? And this whole issue of, James II basically wanting to, subvert the British rule of law here. And we will see how this comes up again in the American Revolution. And of course, Britain saw their European nations, especially Catholic ones, as being enslaved, right? So again, there's also the religious difference here, right? So language of liberty. So the ideas of liberty went beyond the voters, office holders, and political debaters. Most white men in Britain and its colonies lacked the right to vote, but served on juries and protested in the streets against any oppressive authority. So we will see how this obviously, of course, really comes to light when we look at the beginnings of the American Revolution. We'll take a look at that in the next chapter here. Sorry, I just want to take a little swig of water. We will talk about how that this idea of liberty really takes off here within the colonies, and how that the colonies, of course, are very, we're going to look at some of those key, those key separations that separated the colonies from the British here. But the reason why this is important is because I want you all to see where the seeds of liberty are being planted, right? This idea that the public has the right to protest against the government, right? That if they don't agree with what the government is doing, they can take to the streets, they can go and petition their government. And so we're going to talk about how this transpired with the American colonists here. So we also have this idea of Republican liberty, right? Republicanism celebrated active participation in public life by economic independent citizens. Now, do keep in mind that this is different from the republicanism that we tend to see today, right? Republicanism, you can actually make an argument, is more so like liberalism is, and this whole idea, there's a lot, in terms of liberalism today, right? So there's Republican liberty and there's also liberal freedom. So they're both, rather synonymous here. That this, you could say that, the republicanism kind of looks like liberalism today, and liberalism today kind of looks more like conservatism here. But the idea behind Republican liberty is the republicanism held virtue, right? Meaning a willingness to subordinate self-interest to the public good, to be crucial in public life. So this was the idea of, the greatest good for the greatest number, so to speak, right? And we're also going to see that this is during the time where we start to see some of these British philosophers like John Locke, who tends to favor, John Locke, who, Thomas Jefferson was very heavily influenced by John Locke, because he talks about this idea of individual rights, the consent of the governed, and the right of rebellion against unjust or oppressive government. So we're going to see that Thomas Jefferson, when we discuss the Declaration of Independence, he's going to talk a lot about this. He's going to talk about a lot about this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea that the government does not have the right to tell us how to live our lives. The government does not have the right to tell us, what we define as happiness, right? We define that for ourselves. And so Locke's ideas excluded many from freedom's full benefits in the 18th century, again, such as, the slaves and all that. But this opened the door for many to challenge the limitations on their own freedom later on. So this is important, that even though Locke didn't have certain groups in mind, like women, minorities, as eventually they would then gain their freedom through the ideas of Locke, this idea of equality for everyone, and for the law to apply equally to everyone here. Okay, so anyway, so then the right to vote, of course, this is what suffrage is. Suffrage is considered the right to vote. At this time, of course, ownership of property is still the main requirement. So this eliminated a lot of people to be able to vote, as well as, based on religion, such as Jews, Catholics, Baptists, and Quakers, they could not vote in some of these colonies here. And voting suffrage was almost universally limited to males, right? So again, females, could not vote. Same thing with the slaves, and even the free blacks, they couldn't vote as well. Native Americans could not vote as well. So again, so at this point, it's the only real people who can vote are white male property owners. We will see this property requirement, change, especially under the Jackson administration later on, which we'll talk about this here in a bit. But anyway, so again, just more about this political culture here. Just note that this idea of deference is important. And we still see this idea even to this day that a lot of Americans tend to defer politics and political involvement to the most qualified people that tend to be richer, have more education, have more social standing. We tend to cater to them, and we tend to allow for them to kind of take the lead on policy agendas. And again, we still see that even to this day. That's why I think we've talked about before how a lot of people tend to pay attention to, like, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, a lot of these, these really well-to-do, Jeff Bezos as well, these really well-to-do, multi-billionaires, right? Because there's a reason why they have that money, right? So a lot of people tend to look at that, hey, we'll definitely trust what they have to say because they have their money for a reason. So, and we still see that even to this day, so to speak. So we also have what's called salutary neglect. This is another key term, that during the first half of the 18th century, the colonies were largely left to govern themselves. This is going to be a big point of contention in the next chapter, because once the colonies start to get more micromanaged, this is where the colonists are going to fight back, because they're not going to like that now that Great Britain is starting to micromanage them more. So again, as we mentioned before, the colonies basically were kind of doing their own thing, but we're going to start to see that that's going to change, and that's going to cause some major issues here, right? So rise of assemblies here. So this is where we have the elected assemblies in these states. So we had talked about, like, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, but we're starting to see more of these legislative houses in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and South Carolina. So we're starting to see the idea of assemblies is really good, because it talks about how that instead of the governors basically deciding everything, now we're starting to see elective legislative bodies have this. This is no different than what we saw in England, right? The king versus parliament, who ultimately has control. And due to the Glorious Revolution, we saw that ultimately parliament gained control. And so we're going to see the same thing happening here, right? We're going to see that assemblies basically are going to gain the upper hand over the governors and things like that. Last couple of things here we'll talk about is the press also really gained a lot of traction here when it came to all these different newspapers that were coming up. Benjamin Franklin founded the first library in colonial America. So this is something where, so many people were being encouraged to, to write newspapers and to, distribute these newspapers here. And so this idea of freedom of speech and freedom of the press was, these are relatively new ideas, right? This idea that, should people be able to speak out against the government and not fear retribution, right? Do we have that? And of course, we will talk about freedom of speech later on here when we get to the Constitution. But the idea of allowing for people to be able to say things, even if the government doesn't like it, is something that originally was looked at as rather dangerous, right? Does the press have the responsibility to inform the public about what the government is doing, even if the government doesn't like that? So we'll talk about that here a little bit later here. So American Enlightenment, of course, is really important. This, of course, is where we start to see, the transition from, from just focusing on religion to just, to answer a lot of the questions, but moving to social science, the scientific method that was influenced by, the Renaissance, and then ultimately the Enlightenment period. Like I said, we mentioned John Locke and all these other ones like Montesquieu, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and all these other British scholars here. And then the belief in deism, the notion that because God set up natural laws to govern the universe, following the act of creation, God did not intervene in the world, embodied the spirit of the American Enlightenment. So a lot of the framers considered themselves deists here. Okay, last couple of things. I know it's already going to be time. Just know about the Great Awakening. This was a series of local events united by a commitment to a more emotional and personal Christianity. So this was this idea of trying to get back to basics, right? A lot of these preachers during the Great Awakening, such as Jonathan Edwards, as well as George Whitefield, they saw that America was kind of, in their opinion, was kind of becoming too secular, was kind of throwing religion to the wayside. And so they were trying to bring people back into, back into religion here. So, okay, so I know it's already going to be time to go. So that pretty much covers everything that we needed to here. It talks a little bit of the Spanish and the French here. But again, we'll see if we can, that's fine. We'll see if we can pick this up next time. So, okay, so let's go to an end for today. Does anyone else have any other questions before we leave for today? I hope this made a little bit more sense in terms of chapter 4 here really quickly. Is there anything that I could help you all with, or anything else? So again, so most of this chapter focused on slavery as well as the political shifts that we were seeing within the colonies, in terms of the colonies wanting more self-governance, and we'll see how that plays into a factor in chapter 5 when we discuss the beginnings of the American Revolutionary War. We'll cover that next time. So anything else that you all have questions about, or not really? Nothing else? Nothing else? Okay, all right, everyone. Okay, sounds good. Okay, well then I guess we can go to an end for today. Like I said, I'll get everything else ready for you all, the study guide, the future chapters as well, so that way you all can work ahead if you all want to. But thank you all so much for coming by. Sorry about this. Hopefully next week things will be much less chaotic, and so we'll kind of get back into a routine here. But thank you all so much for understanding. Thank you for your patience. Again, I'm very sorry. Don't worry. I guarantee you. Yes, Ebony, there'll be class again at 5 as well. So so if you want to stop by in that class, you're more than welcome to. But yeah, there'll be class as well today at 5. So but yeah, so it sounds good. But yeah, like I said, just don't worry. I guarantee you that if you do your work, if you turn in everything, I guarantee you that I'll do all I can to help you get as good a grade as possible. Okay, everyone. I mean, I owe that to you all for how everything has kind of been going this semester. So just please, bear with me. Things will be good. Don't worry. Things will be okay. And as long as you do your work, I can guarantee you'll do well in this class. So, okay, everyone, sounds good. Thank you all so much for the good questions. You all take care, be safe, and if you all want to stop by at 5, you're more than welcome to. But if not, we'll see you all next week. Okay. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Take care, be safe, and have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you all so much. Thank you.